Good morning, and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and I'm one of the co-founders here at Red Chip Poker. Today, we're diving deep into the world of simplified poker strategies, what they are, why players use them, and whether they actually help or hurt your win rate. This one's for serious players who've tinkered with solvers, GTO concepts, or range simplifications, and want to understand the real trade-offs behind those seemingly easy decisions. In this episode, we'll unpack why simplified strategies exist and when they actually cost you EV, how complexity in poker often just gets pushed to later streets, and the hidden danger of comparing simplified GTO to full GTO instead of exploitative play. By the end of this episode, you'll have a sharper lens for evaluating your own shortcuts, and maybe rethink whether keeping it simple is costing you money. With that said, here's Coach Weasel to break it all down. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. We're going to be talking about simplified poker. The first time I heard poker players talking about the idea of simplifying the poker game tree was a good 7 years ago. And I really wouldn't be surprised if conversations about simplifying poker occurred before then. After all, poker is very complex. It makes sense that poker players would want to take the edge of that complexity and make their day-to-day decisions much more straightforward. However, is there a dark side to simplified strategies? On the surface, it sounds great. We get to play poker, we get to make money, our thought process doesn't need to be that complex. In fact, for some this might be the poker dream, the idea of just clicking buttons, not having to think too hard, and generating profits as a result. Well, let's start at the beginning. What exactly are simplified strategies? I'm sure there are numerous things we could refer to at the poker table as a simplified strategy, but often players are thinking about something very specific when they hear the term simplified strategy, a specific technique for reducing the size of the game tree. And that's how the concept originated. We take a solver game tree, we confine it in some way, and measure the EV difference relative to a full tree. So imagine, simple example, we have a range of different c-bet sizings that are being used on the flop in a certain game tree. We decide it's too complex to implement all of those different bet sizings, so we simply remove all of the sizings but one from the game tree, and we have a look at the difference in our expected value. We decide what an acceptable EV loss tolerance is. Very often this is measured in percentage of the pot. We might decide we are okay with EV loss up to 5% of the total pot, for example. However, if the EV loss is larger than that, then we decide that our simplified model is not worthwhile. We have to go about this in a logical way. For example, imagine our solver is using 4 different sizings on the flop, and it really likes to use the small 33% pot sizing on the flop, does occasionally use 50%, occasionally uses larger sizings as well. It generally makes sense that if we pick sizings that the solver is already using at a high frequency, it's going to be less likely to impact our overall EV when we remove the other available sizings. Whereas if we imagine a solver likes to use the underbet sizing, but we remove that from the tree and force the solver to either overbet or check, as we can imagine, we run the risk of a greater EV loss. So we simplify in a logical way, we get a feel for what the solver is doing anyway, then construct a simplified game tree based around that. Some of the most common examples you'll be familiar with. Many players choose to c-bet their entire range on the flop for 33% pot. Now there are levels to this type of strategy. Some players may automatically c-bet every flop texture, while other players may decide to differentiate based on flop texture and not necessarily c-bet range on every texture. Either way, we're still talking about simplified strategy. The idea that in some spots, we might c-bet our entire range, even though if we look at a solver model in the same spot, the solver doesn't do that. The solver has some kind of checking frequency, but when we compare our version of things to the solver version of things, we find that the EV loss is negligible. There are many other examples of simplified strategies that players use. For example, no cold call in the small blind. This is very common. Many players play 3-bet only from the small blind. This is another type of simplification technique because when we have a look at solver output, it is correct to have a cold calling range in the small blind. And by not having a cold calling range in the small blind, we will reduce the expected value of our small blind play. However, if we decide the EV loss is negligible, perhaps within our 5% of the total pot margin, we may decide that it's an acceptable simplification. There are other examples that haven't necessarily been actively decided upon, but end up being relics of much older ideas regarding poker strategy. For example, when was the last time you donk bet the flop, donk bet the turn, or donk bet the river? Some of you may make use of these lines, but there are many players out there who just never donk bet. They always check to the PFR. Now, the reason why players have done that historically is rooted in a belief that it's incorrect to donk bet into the aggressor from the previous street. Theoretically incorrect. However, work with solvers has shown us that depending on the texture, it may be correct to donk bet the flop, turn, or river. We now know that it's theoretically correct, but many players continue to check their entire range to the PFR. This may not be a deliberate attempt at simplification, but the end result is, again, a simplified strategy. And even if we did plug both strategies into a solver, one strategy where donk bet's allowed, another strategy where players are forced to check if they want the aggressor on the previous street, we may once again find that the EV difference is negligible. We may find that actually it depends on the texture. Maybe we are giving up significant EV by refusing to have a donk bet range on specific textures. Another example is the singular use of RFI and 3-bet sizings. Part of the reason for this is that many players don't realize at this stage that it's correct to have multiple RFI sizings and multiple 3-bet sizings. Poker strategy hasn't typically reached that level. Of course, some players may be intuitively aware of the idea that multiple sizings make sense exploitatively, but in terms of theory, in terms of GTO, many players assume that using a single RFI sizing is correct, and that mirrors the type of output we get from solvers. Since preflop solves very often make use of a single RFI sizing, the natural assumption that many players make is it must be correct to use a single RFI sizing. To build a game tree with multiple RFI sizings would have significant implications on the amount of RAM required to build the tree. It's not something that's commonly done. But if we did do that, if we did have a solve where multiple RFI sizings were available, we'd see that the solver makes use of a range of different sizings pre-flop. So when players say things like, I always 3x from the button, 3 big blinds is my button RFI sizing, that's actually an example of a simplified strategy, whether it's intentional or not. For now, let's focus on deliberate attempts to simplify the game tree, where a player has perhaps run a GTO model and then ran a corresponding simplified GTO model to analyze the EV loss. Here's the first important question. Is the EV loss between models accurate? Now, in some cases, the answer is yes, and that's because GTO has a tendency to compensate for confinements in the tree by adjusting play at other nodes. Imagine, for example, that the solver would really like to overbet the flop, but we've simplified the bet sizings available to the solver. The solver is forced to bet 33% pot. That's not ideal for the solver, but it doesn't necessarily impact heavily on the expected value of hands which would have preferred to overbet the flop. Why not? Those hands can simply overbet on turn and river, depending on which sizings are available. So solver has a tendency to be able to compensate. This is one of the reasons why we don't see noticeable EV loss unless we oversimplify the tree. But making a few small simplifications, for example, reducing the number of sizings being used on the flop, the solver still has plenty of time to compensate with turn and river play. However, there is a problem with this type of model. When players run these models, villain is usually confined in an equivalent manner, which doesn't necessarily represent reality. If, when we're simplifying the game tree, we're simplifying heroes' options, we're also simplifying villains' options at the same time, part of the reason why we're going to experience a very small EV loss is because while we weaken our game, we are weakening our opponent's game to an equivalent degree. So just keep in mind, if you are running such models, the ideal version of this is that heroes' options get simplified, but villain should still have the full range of options at his disposal. We can't assume that our opponent is going to be following a simplified game plan just because we are. But this is a fairly minor issue. As we're going to go on to see, our problems get larger and larger from this point onwards. The next question is definitely more problematic. Is the EV even accurate? Let's just take a flop situation, for example. We've decided that we're going to c-bet range for 1/3 pot. We've stripped other sizings from the tree. The EV on our flop play didn't really change that much. Is the EV even accurate though? And the bigger problem we run into here is that the answer is invariably no. Because solver EV is based around unrealistic assumptions anyway. It's based around the idea that both ourselves and our opponent are going to be playing perfect GTO poker on the later betting nodes. And that's simply not accurate. I hope this is obvious at this stage, although sometimes these technical details may fly under the radar. But our flop EV is based around how we navigate the later streets. Flop EV is not something that exists in a vacuum. It's a calculation that takes into account all of the possible actions that may occur on future streets, the turn and river in this case. Well, if we take that simplified solver model and start having a look at the play on the turn and river, in most cases, we're very quickly going to find that that's not exactly how we're playing poker. And ideally for good reason. Hopefully we're not trying to follow GTO strategies on the turn and river. But the thing is, even if we were trying to follow GTO strategies, it's beyond the realm of what's possible for humans in most cases. It's going to be very difficult to replicate that GTO approach across the turn and river accurately, even if we wanted to. So not only is it not really the right thing to do, but even if we wanted to, we probably couldn't do it very well. The upshot of this is those flop EVs don't really mean anything. Not to mention, we don't have any control over how our opponent plays. It's one thing if we play a perfect GTO strategy, but that doesn't mean that our EV is going to match up with the EV that's shown to us by the solver, because our opponent is not going to be playing GTO. We can almost guarantee that, and our expected value is also going to be a function of how our opponent defends against our play on the later streets. Just on the topic of it being quite difficult to execute the correct strategies on the turn and river, an associated concept here is that simplified strategies have a tendency towards shifting complexity to later streets. Let me give you a simple example, again talking about the c-bet range for 1/3 pot strategy. The flop play is very straightforward. If we don't differentiate between textures, we can just c-bet everything in position heads up as the PFR for 33% pot. That doesn't really take any brain power, it's just a case of executing over and over again. But think about the range of hands that reaches the turn in that scenario when our opponent calls against our c-bet. We have a very wide range. We have all of the hands that open raised pre-flop getting to the turn. This means that our turn decisions are going to be more complex than they would have been if we'd taken a different line on the flop. Imagine, for example, we start immediately embracing the complexity of our flop c-bet decision, and we start filtering our hands into groups. Hands that make sense as a c-bet, hands that make sense as a check, and part of that filtering process is thinking about how hands play on the turn. Do they play better on the turn after c-betting the flop? Do they perhaps prefer to keep the pot small and check back the flop and play the turn in that scenario? When we start filtering our range early on in the hand, we deal with the complexity earlier on, but by the time we get to the turn, our decisions are arguably more straightforward. We've deliberately reached the turn in the scenario that makes sense for the hand that we have. The point we're trying to make here is that poker is complex, and there's only so much we can do to actually avoid that. We have to start dealing with the complexity at some point, otherwise we're just playing bad poker. For example, why not just bet 1/3 pot, flop, turn, and river with every hand that we ever get dealt? That's a really simple strategy, right? Problem is, we are very likely to start losing EV, which means we have to scale up the complexity at some point. We have to start thinking on one of the three streets. Are we going to use different bet sizings? Are we going to split our range between bet and check? Simplified strategies, the only thing they really do is delay that complexity to a later street. And by the time we do have to deal with it, it's going to be even more complex than it would have been if we just dealt with it initially. Now, the counter argument to that is by simplifying early on, perhaps we won't even have to deal with the complexity at the same frequency. For example, when I c-bet range on the flop 100%, some of the time my opponent's going to fold, I never have to deal with that increased complexity on the turn. However, the counter argument could be if I'm only betting 1/3 pot on the flop, my opponents are going to continue more often against that. Whereas if I mix in some larger sizing, some overbets, maybe I don't have to play the turn as often. So the summary here is that solver output does not tell us our EV, and it's also questionable how much simplified strategies actually simplify the game of poker. Poker's complex. There's only so much we can do to avoid that anyway. Now, these are medium-sized problems, but there's a really big problem, and that's to do with the expectation of playing exploitatively. Now, I hope you realize at this stage and agree with the idea that the objective of poker is to play exploitatively. There's a lot of confusion about this in the industry, even amongst high-stakes circles. Many players still believe that poker players have a fundamental choice to make. Should I be a GTO player or should I be an exploitative player? This is really a fake comparison. The objective of poker is to play exploitatively. Even GTO strategies are actually exploitative strategies. GTO poker is the max exploit strategy against an opponent who is also playing GTO poker. Anytime we deliberately follow a GTO or Nash equilibrium strategy against an opponent who is not playing GTO, we're sacrificing win rate. We could be playing exploitatively, but we're not maximizing our earnings from the game. So here's where the comparison between a full solver model and a simplified solver model really starts to fall apart. The issue is that it's not the right thing to be comparing. We should not be comparing two solver models. That's because solver models show us how to play GTO poker, or at least an approximation of it. We should not be comparing a full solver strategy to a simplified solver strategy. So what should we actually be comparing? We should be comparing solver strategy, whether it's full solver or simplified. We should be comparing solver strategy to exploitative strategy. Only then can we actually determine our EV loss. It doesn't really matter what a full solver solution loses in EV relative to a simplified solution because we shouldn't be trying to play GTO poker anyway. What we're interested in, how much EV does the solver version of things lose compared to the exploitative version of things? The basic idea here is that simplified GTO strategy or any GTO strategy could lose a lot in EV relative to exploitative play. So here is the big problem with simplified strategies. It's that those simplified strategies are GTO oriented. So when players say things like, I've run the models in the solver and I can see that with this simplified strategy, my EV loss is less than a big blind for this specific situation or less than 5% of the total pot. Yes, you might be correct, but you're comparing it to the wrong thing. Just because you're losing not very much relative to full solver strategy doesn't mean you're playing very well, because you could be hemorrhaging chips relative to the full exploitative strategy in that scenario. So let's summarize by comparing the two options, thinking about exploitative play versus a simplified GTO strategy. So the pros of a simplified strategy is that it's arguably simpler at a current node. I use the term arguably because I do think that it does depend on your perspective, and having less bet sizings available doesn't necessarily simplify things. I'll give you an example. When we think about small blind cold calling range and how many players play 3-bet only from the small blind, well, the idea is that it's meant to be simpler, right? We're only going to 3-bet in this spot. We don't need to worry about a cold calling range. So because we're only thinking about one range instead of two ranges, that means it's simpler. But I always found it quite complex to play certain types of holding in a 3-bet pot from the small blind when I think they should ideally be cold called with a high frequency. So in my mind, it wasn't simplifying things. It was an arbitrary constraint that funneled you into a situation that didn't play as smoothly as it could have. So this is why I use the term arguably. Some players may not think that it's simpler. I suppose if we were looking to play GTO poker, another advantage of the simplified strategy is that it is GTO based, so it should have comparable results to the fuller game tree version of things. And I do think there are some situations where exploitative simplification might make sense. So if we're not increasing our expectation exploitatively with a certain line, then it probably is okay to simplify. But you can see the key difference is we should be comparing a full exploitative strategy with a simplified exploitative strategy rather than comparing the equivalent GTO strategies. So a simple example could be donk bet flop, for example. If we don't donk bet the flop, that's technically a simplification. We know that in theory we're supposed to have a donk bet range on the flop depending on the texture. How much do we actually lose in the EV if we never have a donk bet range on the flop? In terms of exploitative EV, we might not lose that much, but it does depend on our opponent. There might be some opponents who drastically overfold to donk bets. There could be other opponents who raise hyper aggressively against donk bets and always fire the turn. And if either of these two things are true, then we absolutely are sacrificing too much EV by not having a donk bet range. Simple example, if our opponent always raises flop and fires a turn against a donk bet, we probably want to be donk betting our strong hands to increase the amount of value that we get. But assuming that our opponent doesn't have any obvious exploits, how much are we giving up by not having a donk bet range? You could argue that we might not be giving up too much. Ideally, this is based around pull tendencies or villain tendencies. The donk bet node doesn't seem that attractive as an exploit, but the flop c-bet node might be fairly attractive as an exploit. For example, one thing that we find with pull data is that players have a tendency to overfold versus small bets, but over-continue versus large bets. We have a really simple argument for sizing up when we have high equity, but keeping our size small when we have a hand that has low equity. Really simple exploit based on pull tendencies. But if we're just hammering 1/3 pot button, then we're not taking advantage of those exploits. Sometimes players say things like, well, my opponent's overfolding, so I am exploiting him when I'm betting 1/3 pot. And that's true. Even though you're following a simplified GTO strategy, you are inherently exploiting your opponent based on a mistake that they're making, but you're not generating the maximum exploit. See, players might be overfolding against small sizings, but over-defending against large sizings, in which case we should size up when we have strong value. And if we don't do that, we're missing exploitative opportunity. So as we can see, simplified poker could end up being a big problem. The cons with simplified strategy. Firstly, you could argue that it increases later street complexity. Now, you're entitled to your opinion on that. It probably does depend on the situation. You might think that it's still simpler to c-bet 1/3 pot on the flop with our entire range, even though we have to deal with that on the turn. And that's fine. This is more opinion-based. The big con with simplified strategies is that it is, in most cases, a GTO-style strategy, at least the way that players are thinking about simplified strategies. It means we're losing exploitative win rate. Like we mentioned at the outset, the term simplified could refer to a variety of techniques. So a simplified exploitative strategy might make a lot of sense. If we determine that there's not a lot of exploitative EV gain in a specific scenario and we can simplify our strategy, it makes sense. The real problem is when our simplified strategies are GTO based, when our entire style should be exploitatively based. All right, I hope this has given you something to think about. Thanks very much for listening. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you liked it, and if you did, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. If this episode got your gears turning about GTO, simplified strategies, and where EV is really won and lost, then you're going to love our book, GTO Gems 2. This book dives even deeper into real-world application of solver concepts, with crystal clear examples and no fluff. Whether you're simplifying, exploiting, or just trying to plug leaks, this book connects the dots and helps you make smarter decisions at the table. Get your copy of GTO Gems 2 today by visiting redchip.poker/gems2. That's gems and then the number 2. You can also search for it on Amazon if you prefer paperback. Links for both are in the description box as well. That's going to be it for this episode. I'll see you back soon with a brand new episode. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.